It's my honor to introduce the 5th annual Robert C. Brion Lecture here at the AAS this evening. The lecture is named for Bob Brion, who served as the chairman of the AAS Council from 1993 to 2003. Bob is a man of many talents. He worked designing computers for the Mariner space program, and later was one of the co-founders of Prime Computer Company. After retiring from that area of the business world, he founded Fulcrum Publishing, which publishes a wide range of books and is also active in the environmental movement. Bob and his wife Charlotte have long been generous friends at AAS, where they have endowed 2 fellowships for creative and performing artists. Upon Bob's retirement from the chairmanship of the council, a group of his friends decided that a lecture given annually by a distinguished member of the society would be an excellent way to honor Bob's service and recognize his intellectual curiosity. The premise of the Brion Lecture is to ask a winner of a major book award to deliver a retrospective lecture looking back on the prize-winning work and reflecting on the goals and purposes of the book at the time of writing, as well as thinking about how that work has held up and what it has to say today. Our speaker this year is a bit difficult to introduce, since in a conversation last week, in response to a question about who was giving tonight's lecture, a colleague in the field described him as only the most famous American historian ever. It could probably be left at that, but of course I won't leave it at that. David Brion Davis is the Sterling Professor of History Emeritus at Yale University, where he was also the founder and first director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. He received his BA in philosophy from Dartmouth College and his PhD in history from Harvard. His teaching career took him from Dartmouth to Cornell and then to Yale, where he taught for 32 years, as well as stints at Oxford and in Paris, and periods as a Fulbright lecturer in India, Guyana, and the West Indies. Professor Davis's scholarship possesses the kind of reach and depth that fills younger scholars with mingled feelings of despair and hope. Despair that one will ever be able to produce anything comparable, and hope for the project of history in general, since it shows that such achievements are possible. His first book, Homicide in American Fiction, 1798 to 1860, was published in 1957. And his most recent book, which is for sale after the lecture, by the way, Inhuman Bondage, The Rise and Fall of Slavery in the New World, appeared in 2006. In the 39 years between those 2 publications, at least 17 other books, I may have counted wrong, appeared, of which Professor Davis was either the author or the editor. His 1976 book, The Problem of Slavery in the Age of Revolution, received both the Bancroft Prize and the National Book Award for History, and the book Professor Davis will be talking about tonight, The Problem of Slavery in Western Culture, was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for History in 1967. Professor Davis is renowned as the most preeminent historian of slavery, both in the United States and the Atlantic world, but he is just as famous in the historical profession as a teacher, which is witnessed by the generation of scholars that he advised and sent forth from Yale. An indication of his stature both as a scholar and as a teacher came in 2004, when he received both the Bruce Catton Prize from the Society of American Historians for Lifetime Achievement in History, and the same year he received the Kidger Award from the New England History Teachers Association in honor of his devotion to teaching. In a letter to his parents, written from occupied Germany in October 1946, the internet is a wonderful thing, Professor Davis wrote about his plans for college when he returned home from the service. He had previously written to them that he planned to major in physics, but now he wrote, "It strikes me that history and proper methods of teaching it are even more important at present than endocrinology and nuclear fission. The physical sciences loss will clearly be our gain." In this letter, he described history as an unearthing of truths long buried beneath superficial facts and propaganda, a presentation of perspective, and an overall comprehensive view of what people did and thought and why they did it. I can't think of any better description of the historian's task, which is why it gives me such great pleasure to welcome David Brion Davis to the Antiquarian Society.
Thank you so much, Mr. Erickson, and it's an enormous honor to be giving the Robert C. Brion Lecture, and I was honored to meet Mr. Brion a few moments ago, and I want to thank Ellen Dunlap and Paul Erickson and everyone else who has been involved in arranging this evening's event. It is a bit challenging to look back 42 years on a book published that long ago and try to make sense of things. I'm often asked how I became preoccupied back in the 1950s with what I've termed the problem of slavery, and then continued to pursue the subject for over 50 years. I was at least introduced to the legacy of American slavery in 1945, just after the end of World War II, having earlier been trained as a combat infantryman for the invasion of Japan. My first taste of a racially segregated army came on board a troop ship bound for France in the fall of 1945. We then traveled for 5 days on railway boxcars on to Germany. On the ship, still wobbly from seasickness, I was given a billy club and sent down into the deep hold to make sure that the, quote, Negroes there, quote, were not gambling. Until then, I had not dreamed that the ship contained some 12,000 black soldiers. After winding down endless circular staircases, I found myself, in effect, on board a slave ship, or what I imagined some slave ships to have been like, though the blacks were not chained together. Gazing through flickering light at dozens of crowded crab games, I was greeted by some amused, nearly naked black soldiers who asked, "What you doing down here, white boy?" I soon found a shadow in which to hide. Some 2 months later, as a member of the security police in occupied Germany, I was increasingly struck by the contrast between young Germans who allegedly believed in Aryan supremacy, but seemed to warmly accept black Americans, and our own white troops, many of whom were ready to declare war on the, quote, goddamn black sons of bitches who dated German girls. In a letter home, like the one just voted, I told my parents how after some minor raid on a Belgian black marketeer, a riot alarm rang through our old German police building, one of the very few structures in Mannheim not reduced to rubble. Some officer shouted, "Niggers." In 3 minutes, we were roaring in the night through empty streets in jeeps, wearing steel helmets and carrying submachine guns. Nobody seemed to know what it was all about. When we pulled up to a curb, I immediately saw splashes of blood on the sidewalk and bullet marks outside a typical, for those days, GI club with a dance floor, a bar, and an orchestra stand. As we entered this smoke-filled room, a crowd of officers stood in the middle of the floor with lots of blood and broken glass not far from their feet. Attention focused on an angry argument between a black captain and our outranked Southern West Point lieutenant, who began by saying, quote, "Now, as I understand it, these niggers from your company," glaring eyeball to eyeball, and I'm quoting from my letter home. The black officer stood more erect and said, "Cut out that nigger stuff, see?" Our commander then said, "Shut up, you nigger," and ordered us to prepare to fire at the black troops, some of whom were still armed. We were ordered to pull back the bolts on our submachine guns. Everyone stood tense as the two officers faced each other, and then the cry of "Attention!" and a gray-haired major stomped in, sleepy-eyed, very plainly aroused from sleep a few minutes before. More argument and waving of arms. The black captain explained that this had been going on ever since his company had moved into the area. According to one rumor, some armed black troops had entered an all-white GI club in this segregated army, but more likely it had been the other way around. A fight had broken out. Then military police had come, one of whom was shot, and the battle then spilled out into the street just before we arrived. If it had not been for that timely arrival of the major, I might have been faced with an order to shoot my fellow black American troops. Later on, this racial hostility was outrageously exploited by Major General Ernest Harmon, who became the commander of what was called the U.S. Constabulary. And he lectured hundreds of us on the, quote, niggers, who were a much bigger problem than the Germans. What was especially upsetting to me was the way most white troops cheered Harmon on. As I wrote home, quote, "One of the biggest mistakes the Army ever made was race segregation, which swings the larger undecided group towards intolerance. Even as a teenager in occupied Germany, I glimpsed the cancerous racial division and exploitation that has festered really at the core of American society for well over 300 years. A few years later, as I moved on through college and graduate school, I read such pioneering works as Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma, and began to see the strong links between the segregated and racist army, which President Truman bravely reformed in the Korean War, and then the way most American historians had dealt with issues of slavery and race. In 1950, it was an embarrassment to find a passage like the following in a popular history that had won acclaim from New Deal liberals like my own parents. Quote, "The slave system did incalculable harm to the white people of the South and benefited nobody but the Negro, in that it served as a vast training school for African savages. Though the regime of the slave plantation was strict, it was on the whole a kindly one by comparison with what the imported slave had experienced in his own African land. It taught him discipline, cleanliness, and a conception of moral standards." I quote from W.E. Woodward's A New American History, which was published in 1936 and got rave reviews. This was essentially the view popularized by movies like Gone with the Wind, and embodied in Yale professor Ulrich B. Phillips's classic book entitled American Negro Slavery, which was still the only comprehensive scholarly work on the subject of American slavery when I attended Harvard Graduate School 35 years after its publication in 1918. In the early 1950s, slavery was consigned to a very marginal place in the curriculum. It was scarcely mentioned in the courses I took at Harvard. Let me give an extremely revealing example, which I actually mentioned to Mr. Barrett a bit earlier. Perry Miller, whom I consider the most brilliant teacher and scholar I had at Harvard, was the author in 1965 of a posthumous first volume of a much larger project he never finished, The Life of the Mind in America, from the Revolution to the Civil War. The book is a magnificent account of religion, the legal mentality, and science. It carries immense praise on the cover by such figures as Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and the great theologian and liberal minister Reinhold Niebuhr. But the index contains nothing on slavery, anti-slavery, or abolition, pro-slavery, Negro, or race. The same is true of his plan for Book 3, which is outlined at the end. Yet Miller was writing about the period from 1776 through 1865. As I later went through my notes, I found the same omissions in his great lecture course on the history of religion in America. Let me add that after preparing for my PhD orals in the history of American civilization, I remained totally ignorant of the work of such black historians as W.E.B. Du Bois, Carter Woodson, Benjamin Quarles, and Eric Williams. But in my last semester at Harvard, when I was finishing my dissertation on homicide, I had the exceptional good fortune to make the acquaintance of Kenneth M. Stamp, a visiting professor from Berkeley, who was working on his landmark book, The Peculiar Institution, which in 1956 became the first serious challenge to Ulrich Phillips's American Negro Slavery. Like Phillips, Stamp had done prodigious research in plantation records and other sources. But unlike Phillips, Stamp based his work on the premise of inherent racial equality. As Stamp also emphasized, and I quote, "One must know what slavery meant to the Negro and how he reacted to it before one can comprehend his more recent tribulations." I was much influenced by Kenneth Stamp, who revealed an enormous gap in my education just as I was completing graduate studies. I soon hoped to do for the neglected subject of American anti-slavery what Stamp had done for slavery. Of course, the explosion of new scholarship on slavery and anti-slavery in the 1960s and 70s was closely related to and nourished by the civil rights movement. As an exceptional example, my late Yale colleague, C. Van Woodward, no relation to the other Woodward I spoke of, marched at Selma with Martin Luther King Jr., who hailed Woodward's book, The Strange Career of Jim Crow, as the Bible of the civil rights movement. If The Problem of Slavery in Western Culture had been published in 1946 or 1956 instead of 1966, I am sure it would not have won the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction. It was not actually history, as often is said. It was the prize for nonfiction, defeating even Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, or the other two awards I was so lucky to get. As I began my own research on American anti-slavery and related reform movements in the late 1950s, I had no expectation that this would be a lifelong project on slavery in the New World, or that my planned opening chapter on the long-term historical, quote, background, that is what I had thought of as simply an opening chapter on the problem of slavery in Western culture, which would be the beginning of a study of anti-slavery. I had no idea that this chapter would be transformed into a 505-page book. In 1958, I had been teaching at Cornell for 3 years, when I had the immense good fortune of being granted tenure and winning a year's Guggenheim Fellowship for my project. Cornell's library had a phenomenal collection of American and British anti-slavery materials. But Henry Allen Moe, the Guggenheim Foundation's first administrator from its inception, and later the first director of the National Endowment for the Humanities, persuaded me in a face-to-face talk to spend a year abroad. That is not working, doing research at Cornell, but going off to London in this case. Mr. Moe deserves much credit for the broad scope of my work, since it was at the library of the Old British Museum that I discovered the global dimensions of slavery and the surprising continuities in the history of both slavery and intellectual responses to slavery, from Greco-Roman antiquity to the emerging labor systems of the New World. No doubt I was especially receptive to this information, since as an undergraduate I had majored not in history but in philosophy, and had concentrated especially on the changing philosophical conceptions of human nature and on Western culture in general. While greatly excited in London by the expanding scope of my project, I also became really worried over the prospect of spending years and years doing research. I'd been under great personal pressure in graduate school at Harvard and had done my dissertation in 1 year. Now in London, I acquired another great debt. Now to the great colonial American historian, Carl Brion, who was then 55, I was 31. Carl had also received a Guggenheim Fellowship that had brought him to the British Museum. We often ate lunch together in a nearby British pub, and Carl greatly encouraged my ambitious goals and kept repeating, "David, what tenure is all about. It's why we have tenure, so that people like you can take on larger projects and don't have to worry about deadlines. At the outset, I was struck by three amazing facts. First, even Gunnar Myrdal, who was attuned to sociology and not history, noted the long-term tendency, quote, to localize and demarcate America's Negro problem. And I'm sure that in terms of locating and demarcating, that if we asked most Americans what they thought of when they heard the word slave or slavery, they would think, of course, of the U.S. South. Yet in actuality, if you had traveled in 1776 all the way south from Canada to Chile and Argentina, you would not only have encountered some black slaves in every province, but you would have found that the institution was legal throughout the entire hemisphere. I choose, by the way, 1776 because the next year, 1777, Vermont became the first place in the New World to outlaw slavery, Constitution Day. Second, chattel slavery, in which a rightless individual is legally reduced to the level of livestock or other domesticated animals and can be bought, sold, bequeathed, or inherited as property, is as old as the first human records in ancient Mesopotamia and has appeared in most human societies around the globe throughout history. But third, there were no movements to abolish slavery, even very gradually, until the late 18th century. And with few exceptions, no protests or condemnation of the principle of slavery until the late 17th and early 18th centuries. And then only in areas of Western culture. As for exceptions, I discussed in my book Philo of Alexandria's early 1st century inclusion of radical abolitionist principles in his idealized picture of the Jewish Essenes, a virtue not found in Josephus's account of the same group, or in the surviving Dead Sea Scrolls that have been left. So we have this fascinating example of an idealized picture of a sect, of a given perfectionist group, condemning slavery, barring any members from owning slaves, but there is no evidence they actually did that. I also examined the philosopher Jean Baudin's unique condemnation of slavery in 1586, but I missed St. Gregory of Nyssa, who in the late 300s denounced slavery along with many other saints, but in no way called for any sort of abolition. So if I were rewriting the book today, I would need to add St. Gregory, and I have in other work. Fourth, despite this virtually universal acceptance of slavery, at least in principle, we find that in late Roman law, the Justinian Code of the 6th century, slavery is defined as the only institution that is contrary to the law of nature, yet legitimated by the law of nations. Thus, while Roman law served as a basis for many European legal codes, especially after its rediscovery in the 11th century, and while it provided a strong precedent for accepting slavery, it nevertheless made clear that no slaveholding should exist in a purely natural, that is, sinless world. This tension between the ideal and the real, which ultimately rests, I think, on the impossibility of wholly dehumanizing human beings, is what I term the problem of slavery. It rests on a fundamental contradiction, even though it would require a particular cultural tradition in the West for a full recognition of this contradiction. The basic concept of the slave was modeled on the domesticated animal. Yet the slave's master wanted and needed human capacities and human abilities, which were also expressed in the slave's resistance. When we look carefully, this problem of slavery pervades the Bible, from the selling of Joseph by his brothers to the slave traders who took him on to Egypt, on to the inspiring story of how God responded to the groans and suffering and affliction of the Hebrew slaves in Egypt, and then helped them in their great exodus to the Promised Land. Then we read in the passage from Isaiah, which Jesus, quote, stood up and read, according to St. Luke, in the synagogue of Nazareth. In this example, the ancient Hebrew Jubilee, freeing all slaves every 50 years, prefigured Christ's mission, taken from the words of Isaiah, quote, to proclaim liberty to the captives and the opening of the prison to them that are bound. Again, I should repeat, neither the Bible nor any other known ancient sources contain a clear denunciation or repudiation of slavery, coupled with a call for even its gradual abolition. Indeed, 19th century defenders of slavery pointed endlessly at precedents of ancient Greeks and Romans who celebrated both slavery and freedom and pointed out that Greek slavery and democracy evolved together. I have tried in my work to focus attention on the supreme paradox that Western culture has long combined extraordinary coercion and violence with a celebration of individual freedom. Western Europe was the area in the world that had the very highest death rates from wars and from all kinds of violence. And yet, it's the area that gave birth and rise to the notion of individual freedom. Defenders also make much of the fact that Jesus condemned most of the sins of the world, but never slaveholding. From St. Augustine on to St. Thomas Aquinas, a defense of slavery became integrated into Christian theology, and thus became extremely difficult to challenge. For Aquinas, slavery was part of the governing pattern of the universe, a symbol of man's limitations and need for order and discipline. Slavery was positively sanctioned, moreover, by Luther and Calvin and other leaders of the Protestant Reformation, despite the fact that the institution had long since disappeared from northwestern Europe. Indeed, in 1515, we even find a fully developed system of slavery in Thomas More's famous book, Utopia, the picture of an ideal state which is still in tune, one might say, with human nature. Yet, as I've indicated, Western Judeo-Christian culture transmitted deep tensions or unease over slavery, a fairly common belief that the institution could be justified only by an appeal to our sinful nature, that it could not be tolerated in a perfect or ideal world. So as I concluded in my chapter, The Ancient Legacy, for some 2,000 years, men thought of sin as a kind of slavery. One day, they would come to think of slavery as sin. But let me stress that while I focused on some cultural preconditions for slavery, for anti-slavery, I carefully tried, though not everyone was persuaded, I tried to prevent this theme of tension and unease from implying that there was a teleological stream that led inevitably to an abolitionist outcome. Unfortunately, the complexities of the subject increased the more I learned about the continuing historical justifications for slavery. For example, take the great English philosopher of freedom, John Locke. It's hardly surprising to read his famous proclamation, quote, "Slavery is so vile and miserable an estate of man, and so directly opposite to the generous temper and courage of our nation, that 'tis hardly to be conceived that an Englishman, much less a gentleman, should plead for it. Yet John Locke owned stock in England's major slave trading company. He defended the enslavement of prisoners of war, as in Africa, as a legitimate action outside the sacred social contract, and he even drafted a pro-slavery constitution for the colony of South Carolina. The central question I began to address was what I call the problem of moral perception, or a problem of moral perception. Why was it that at a certain moment of history, a small number of men and women not only saw the full horror of a social evil to which mankind had been blind for centuries, but felt impelled to attack it through personal testimony and cooperative action? As I soon discovered, this question required a very complex analysis of how profound intellectual and cultural change can occur. This was the basic question that guided the first volume of my Problem of Slavery trilogy, which then set the stage for continuing issues regarding the consequences of this, what I call, shift in moral perception. Here I have in mind the specific events and ideological needs that led to a mass movement in Britain for the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade in 1807, and then in 1833 to the emancipation of some 800,000 British colonial slaves, as well as the fate of a parallel but weaker movement in the United States, or movements in the United States, France, and eventually Spain, Cuba, and Brazil. I should mention that these latter subjects involving the causes of slave emancipation have proven to be far, far more controversial than the theses and themes of my first volume. In order to understand the significance of the sudden rise of anti-slavery in the late 18th century, which I examine in some detail in my book, one must have some grasp of the striking and long neglected continuities between Old World and New World, Old World and New World slavery, the millennium and more of struggle between Christian and Muslim societies, beginning in the 7th and 8th centuries, including the Crusades and the conquest and reconquest of Portugal, Spain, and the Mediterranean islands, made the Mediterranean a cauldron of enslavement long, long after slavery had disappeared from Northwest Europe. There was a growing conviction in England and Northwest Europe that only Muslims and pagans could legitimately be enslaved. One sees this nationalism in the famous refrain, "Rule Britannia, Britannia rule the waves, Britons never shall be slaves," a song written in the early 18th century after many generations of Britons had in fact been enslaved by Barbary corsairs who raided Britain's West Country coast and kidnapped huge numbers of people there and on captured British ships. I was actually unaware of this point when I wrote my first volume, and did not put enough emphasis on what David Eltis more recently calls the changing eligibility for enslavement among Europeans. But I did examine many ethnic precedents for the later European purchase of enslaved Africans. The West European words for slave, or esclave in French, esclave in German, esclavo in Spanish, and so on, all derived from the Latin term Slav, esclavus in Latin, meaning a Slav, or a Slavic person. Beginning in the 10th century, a disproportionate number of slaves were taken from the Dalmatian coast, and then from the early 13th to the late 15th centuries, Italian merchants purchased and shipped tens of thousands of so-called Slavic slaves from the Black Sea regions to Christian and Muslim markets throughout the Mediterranean. Long before the birth of Columbus, Genoese and Venetian merchants invented the distinctive institutions that would later be applied to the African trade and West Indian colonization. Arriving on the coasts of the Black Sea in the 13th century, they ultimately established bases or factories, which became thriving markets for the purchase of slaves. Like the later Portuguese, who built forts in West Africa, the Italians were not required to seize slaves on their own. Tatar merchants swarmed to such ports as Tana and eagerly traded their children, neighbors, or captives for precious goods. By 1300, there were even a few black African slaves on the sugar plantations in Cyprus, which had become virtually a prototype for the West Indian colonies. Some Genoese merchants who owned slaves in Cyprus later played an important role in developing commerce in the Atlantic. And Italian sailors and merchants who were more familiar with the Black Sea slave trade were attracted to the first Spanish and Portuguese ventures in slave trading in West Africa. Of course, Columbus himself was an Italian. As I've suggested, some of the Mediterranean slave labor was concentrated in the production of sugar, which was highly labor-intensive, and slowly moved westward from Asia to Palestine, and then to Cyprus, Sicily, southern Spain, and then to such crucial Atlantic islands as Madeira and São Tomé off the African coast. After the Ottoman Turks captured Constantinople from the Christians in 1453 and gradually shut off this huge supply of white slaves, more African slaves were transported by the Arab caravan trade across the Sahara to the Mediterranean. And beginning in the 1440s, there were increasing shipments of black slaves from Africa to Portugal and to the sugar plantations in the Atlantic islands. Ironically, I've even found that in Sicily, notaries were making records in Latin that referred to sclavi negri, literally black Slavs from Africa, who by the 1490s outnumbered white slaves on the island of Sicily. Thus, well before Columbus's first voyage in 1492, most of Europe's sugar was being produced by black slaves, mainly in the Atlantic islands, while New World slavery, which long concentrated almost entirely on the production of sugar, became highly distinctive in terms of scale and racial character and orientation to multinational markets. Charles Verlinden, the great Belgian medieval historian on whose work I relied heavily in my first volume, was surely right when he underscored the strong and crucial continuities between the slave colonies of medieval and early modern times. In 1600, by the way, there were still a few so-called Slavic slaves and Greek slaves in Cuba and other parts of the Caribbean. So to show the continuity, you get some black slaves in Cyprus and Sicily, and you get some Greek and Slavic slaves in parts of the Caribbean, the two ends. These continuities have an important bearing, I think, on the way we view the origins of anti-slavery. And in fact, I argue that the continuities in slavery and slave trading from the medieval Mediterranean and Atlantic islands on to 16th century Brazil, to 16th and 17th century Brazil, and then from Brazil to 17th and 18th century Barbados, Jamaica, Virginia, and South Carolina, show that late 18th century anti-slavery was not a spontaneous and immediate response to a new and unprecedented evil, a wholly new kind of exploitation and dehumanization, as sometimes suggested. There was nothing brand new here. If abolitionists had appeared in the 15th century Sicily or Eastern Spain, or for that matter in the Roman Empire or ancient Greek silver mines, they would have quickly found horrors equal to those of the later Americas. I've thus argued that the emergence of an international anti-slavery opinion, beginning with such events as a repressed anti-slavery petition signed in 1688 by 4 obscure Dutch-speaking Quakers, immigrants in Germantown, Pennsylvania, that these events represented a momentous turning point in the evolution of humanity's moral perception, and thus in the human image of ourselves. As it happened, this signified the extension of human empathy and identification to groups whose systematic dehumanization had traditionally cut them off from such connections of belonging, of being seen as truly human. Some of the early crusaders against slavery were viewed as eccentric zealots or madmen, like the Quaker Benjamin Lade, who was actually disowned by his fellow Quakers or Society of Friends. In 1736, Benjamin Franklin published Lade's Wild Abolitionist Tract, attacking slaveholders, especially Quaker slaveholders, as being notorious apostates, guilty not only of, quote, a hellish practice, but a filthy sin, a capital sin, indeed the greatest sin in the world, of the very nature of hell itself and the belly of hell. These are Lade's words. According to Lade, slaveholding, which he had observed in Barbados as well as Pennsylvania, was, quote, Baal and Sodom and the Black Dragon all rolled into one putrid mass of evil. As these words suggest, one of the key sources of anti-slavery thought can be found in the perfectionist and millennial Christian sects that challenged all traditional authorities and sought to live their lives wholly free from sin. In essence, their ideal involved a form of mutual love and recognition that precluded treating humans in any way as objects or animals. Since the more radical sectarian groups, which emerged in the English Civil Wars in the mid-1600s, also threatened all forms of private property and patriarchal rule, they exceeded the bounds of even Oliver Cromwell's tolerance and never survived the later Stuart Restoration beginning in 1660. But the notable exception, of course, was the Society of Friends, which early found ways to compromise with the Society of Remnant and was thus able to survive. The Quakers combined their quest for a purified life with more pragmatic and institutionalized methods of bearing witness to their faith. They achieved a certain balance between a commitment to perfection and the necessity of living in an imperfect world. In the 18th century, the Quakers also acquired considerable economic and political power and were the only sect to become deeply involved with the Atlantic slave system. By the early 1700s, there were Quaker planters in the West Indies and slave merchants in London, Philadelphia, and Newport, Rhode Island. But during the 7 Years' War, from 1756 to 1763, the pacifist Quaker opposition to war led to much soul-searching and attempts at self-purification, and finally to a commitment to withdraw entirely from slaveholding as well as slave trading. The Quaker decision to require all members of the Society of Friends to free their slaves prefigured the Quaker leadership in the 1770s and 80s in the first anti-slavery movements in both Britain and America. It was not coincidental, I think, that even in France, the first abolitionists called themselves the Amis des Noirs, the friends of the blacks. But a valid emphasis on the pioneering role of Quakers leads then to the question why Quakers were able to exert such surprising influence by the 1780s, for example, in pointing the way to mass petition campaign against the British slave trade. In the problem of slavery in Western culture, I reject the theory that anti-slavery emerged simply or inevitably as the offspring of a continually expanding British philanthropy. There were far too many philanthropists who were involved with slavery or justified it. I rather insist that one must carefully analyze changes in religious values in the face of decaying faith, as well as the challenges imposed by materialistic figures like Thomas Hobbes, who had ignored the human capacity for moral feeling, but asserted that all men are particles of unmitigated self-interest that require, of course, a coercive external authority if total anarchy is to be avoided. Partly in response to the challenge of Hobbesian infidelity, we can see from the 1690s to the 1760s the soaring rise of a so-called cult of sensibility or moral feeling, a belief in Britain in man's inherent moral sense and natural benevolence, exemplified in responses to human suffering. Poets, novelists, essayists, and above all playwrights paid homage to this theme of moral feeling, and in so doing evoked a transformation in public values. While this pre-romantic style originally clashed with neoclassicism and with the hard-boiled realism and sophistication of England's ruling classes, by the 1770s, it had made a cliché of the image of the suffering Negro slave, whose innocence and remoteness, unlike the situation of a British factory worker, removed any sense that intervention would pose a serious threat to England's social order. That said, whether one looks at the 1790s or even the 1830s, two of their most active decades, the British and American abolitionists were deeply religious and were driven by religious motivations, even though the Christian churches were very slow in taking even a cautious and gradualist approach to slave emancipation. But one important source of the anti-slavery impulse, in addition to the so-called man of feeling, the man of feeling I've been discussing, was the new evangelical faith in instantaneous conversion and the human ability to overcome sin. Thus, in 1774, John Wesley, founder of the Methodist Church, made clear that the sins of the world would soon be judged, and that every slaveholder or investor in slave property was deeply stained with blood and guilt. Significantly and tragically, Wesley's church soon backtracked and put the needs of mass religious conversion above the anti-slavery principles of its founder. Even so, John Newton, the author of the Amazing Grace song, who as a sailor and slave ship captain had seen the full horrors of both the slave trade and West Indian plantations, could testify that, quote, inattention and interest had so blinded him to sin that he never doubted the legitimacy of Negro slavery, even after his religious conversion. Newton's decision then to denounce slavery as a crime, and above all to confess his former depravity, became a model for his pious admirers of authentic sanctification. Little known today, such key abolitionist leaders as James Stephen in England and Theodore Dwight Weld in America exemplify the merger of passionate religious faith and a keen political wisdom that powered the abolitionist movements. Now, the Africans' cultural differences, which served as an excuse for various failures at Christianizing slavery, and there was a whole movement I discussed, not against slavery, but a movement to try to Christianize it, uplift it, and make it milder and more humane. And the Africans' cultural differences made that very, very difficult. But those differences acquired increasingly a positive image at the hands of 18th century primitivists, as I would call them, who searched through travel accounts and descriptions of exotic lands for examples of man's inherent virtue and creativity. The literary conventions of noble savages and sable Venuses, reinforced by poems and writings of Africans and African Americans like Equiano and Phyllis Wheatley, helped to modify Euro-Americans' arrogant ethnocentrism and counteract some of the fears and prejudices that had long cut Africans off from the normal mechanisms of sympathy and identification. For many Europeans, as diverse as John Wesley in England and the Abbé Raynal in France, the African was an innocent child of nature whose enslavement in the Americas betrayed the very notion of the New World as a land of natural innocence, a new hope for mankind. By the early 1770s, I would argue, such writers portrayed the Negro slave as a man of natural virtue and sensitivity, who was at once oppressed by the worst vices of civilization, and yet capable of receiving its greatest benefits. Now, quickly turning to the secular Enlightenment, as I've been stressing the religious part, the secular Enlightenment bequeathed mixed messages on slavery and race. The scientific classification of plants and animals, epitomized by the biological breakthroughs of Linnaeus and Buffon, involved an attempted study of human differences that led to a pseudoscience of race and racial superiority. Even Linnaeus, who resisted theories of racial inferiority, described Africans as, quote, phlegmatic, indolent, and negligent, and governed by caprice. Such great figures as Voltaire, David Hume, and, as I more recently discovered, Immanuel Kant, went much further and asserted the natural inferiority of Negroes to whites. As I note in the first volume, the statements of Hume and Voltaire helped to make a defense of the African a defense of religion itself. By repeatedly identifying the theory of racial inferiority with Hume, Voltaire, and alleged atheism, anti-slavery writers undoubtedly made the idea less palatable. But unfortunately, this alignment also had the effect of tying racism to secular science, which had regrettable long-term consequences. To give just one example, the affirmation of Negro inferiority in the classic 1911 Encyclopedia Britannica. On the other hand, continuing with the Enlightenment, it was Montesquieu who put the subject of black slavery on the agenda of the European Enlightenment. Montesquieu weighed the institution against the general laws and principles promoting human happiness and encouraged his readers to imagine how a defender of slavery would respond to a national lottery that would make 9/10 of the population the absolute slaves of the remaining 10th. This shocking idea of role reversal, of having a master and slave exchange positions, became a favorite literary device. And by the 1760s, the arguments of Montesquieu, Diderot, and the Scottish philosopher Francis Hutcheson were being repeated, developed, and propagated by Quakers like Anthony Benezet and various lesser-known writers. Thus, by the eve of the American Revolution, there was a remarkable convergence of cultural, intellectual developments, which at once undercut traditional rationalizations for slavery and offered new modes of sensibility for purifying, for identifying with its victims. It is at this point that the problem of slavery in Western culture concludes, with a rash of anti-slavery books, sermons, poems, plays, and pamphlets, and with the initiative taken by individual reformers in America, England, and France, whose international communication led to an awareness of shared concerns and expectations. If I were writing the book today, I would draw on later historians who have focused more attention on the more general changes in responses to cruelty in general, and others who have done more to illuminate the revolutionary expansion of the media in this period, and still others who have discovered increasing press coverage of African slave revolts on slave ships, which occurred overall on about 15% of all the voyages. Yet if this growth of anti-slavery opinion signified a profound cultural change, which influenced even slaveholders like Washington and Jefferson, what difference did it make in the end? And as the great ancient historian M.I. Finley asked in a long and extremely laudatory review of my book in the New York Review of Books, why was it that such a revolutionary shift in attitudes towards sin, human nature, and progress focused only on slavery and did not extend to racism and other evils of the world? As I tried to show in my second volume, The Problem of Slavery in the Age of Revolution, 1770 to 1823, the question of abolishing slavery ultimately became a question of power, class, and ideology, of finding ways to preserve as well as transform aspects of the social order. These issues, though, have proved to be far, far more controversial than the ones I addressed in the first volume. And given the vast avalanche of social and economic history during the past 42 years, we have acquired a stupendous amount of new information, even though many questions still remain unresolved. No changes in the historiography of slavery in the 42 years I've mentioned have been more significant than the work of Robert Vogel, Stanley L. Engerman, Seymour Drescher, David Eltis, and others, showing that New World slavery was not in economic decline in 1780 or 1830 or even 1860. While these discoveries had limited relevance to my first volume, I did make some appropriate and major revisions in my 1988 paperback edition. The continuing economic strength and vitality of slavery actually reinforced my thesis regarding the central importance of ideas, moral perceptions, and public opinion. While the American Revolution led to the emancipation of tens of thousands of slaves and to the ultimate gradual abolition of slavery here in the North, we now know that racial slavery was far stronger in North America in 1790 than it had been in 1770, and was stronger still in 1800 and 1820. Indeed, by the 1830s, the moral doubts of the revolutionary generation were giving way in the South to strong religious, economic, and racial arguments that defended slavery as a positive good. In the crucial case of Britain, it was ultimately the unprecedented power of well-organized public opinion that overcame the nation's and empire's economic self-interest. As I've said, by outlawing the British slave trade in 1807 and then emancipating 800,000 colonial slaves in 1833, and finally abolishing their so-called apprenticeship in 1838. Yet by the 1850s, there was a growing consensus in Britain that this once called mighty experiment had been an economic disaster. It was only, I would argue, the American Civil War that finally transformed perceptions of British actions into a bold, pioneering moral achievement that led to the extermination of bondage in most of the world. That is the unexpected emancipation of over 4 million slaves in the American Civil War totally transformed the way people viewed the earlier British emancipation, which was beginning to be seen as a colossal economic failure. That said, it's crucial to note again that in 1776, racial slavery was legal throughout the Western Hemisphere, from Canada to Chile. But in 1888, when finally abolished in Brazil, slavery had been outlawed in all the Americas. Almost exactly 1 century after the formation of the first small and feeble American and British anti-slavery societies. Though historians still debate the fundamental reasons and motives for this revolutionary reform, some exaggerating, I think, the importance of slavery goals. It's clear that slave emancipation required, as a precondition, a basic shift in moral perception, and that this change in values and expectations constituted one of the few clear-cut examples in human history of what I won't hesitate to call genuine moral progress.